An arrogant millionaire humiliated passengers and decided to show his power by kicking a woman right on the plane. But he didn't know that it was Ronda Rousey, and in a moment, the entire business class froze in shock. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The hum of the aircraft engines was steady and constant, a sound like a low heartbeat beneath a carefully cultivated atmosphere of calm that filled the business class cabin. The overhead lights glowed softly, casting a warm sheen over rows of wide leather seats. Passengers settled in with the quiet assurance of those who had paid for comfort and exclusivity. Some slipped their laptops onto the fold-out tables and began to type, the glow of screens painting their faces with pale light. Others reclined immediately, closing their eyes, sighing into the pillows provided by the cabin crew. A few lifted glasses of wine and sipped thoughtfully, the clink of ice and crystal like a delicate punctuation against the otherwise measured silence. It was the kind of space designed to make people forget the world below, to imagine that they floated not only above the clouds but above the burdens of life itself. Yet even before the plane left the gate, a ripple disturbed the balance. It began not with noise but with presence, the kind that enters a room and shifts the weight of the air before a word is spoken. Heads turned unconsciously, eyes following the tall figure making his way down the aisle. His arrival was not subtle. It was never meant to be. The man was in his mid-40s, fit in a way that spoke less of discipline and more of vanity. His dark hair was slicked back with a sheen that glistened under the cabin lights, his suit a flawless cut of deep charcoal wool, the stitching so precise it seemed to slice the air as he moved. On his wrist gleamed a watch that could have bought a car, its diamond markers flashing like small lighthouses as his hand gestured broadly at nothing in particular. A faint cologne, expensive and sharp, announced him a few steps before he arrived, forcing itself into the noses of those nearby like a declaration. He did not walk so much as stride, each step heavy with the assurance that the space was his. His voice soon followed, loud and commanding, the kind of voice trained to dominate boardrooms and parties, now spilling into the confined cabin like a performance. "Is this the best you can do?" he asked the nearest flight attendant, though she had offered him nothing more than a polite smile of welcome. He waved a dismissive hand toward the cabin itself, as if critiquing a hotel lobby rather than boarding an aircraft. His tone left no room for courtesy. "I've been in better, much better. These windows smudged. The air's stale already. Don't you people understand the meaning of premium?" The attendant bent slightly, murmuring assurances, but her smile trembled at the edges. She knew what the others in her line of work knew, that men like him had the power to destroy careers with a single complaint, and they relished that knowledge. Passengers glanced toward him and then away quickly, eyes dropping to magazines, to phones, to anything that would prevent catching his notice. They knew the type too. Wealth had made him believe he was untouchable, arrogance had made him loud, and years of unchallenged behavior had made him cruel. He moved further down the aisle, the wheels of his carry-on bag rattling with an entitled rhythm behind him. His eyes swept over the passengers with casual disdain, pausing briefly on a man in a modest blazer before snorting and moving on, pausing again on a woman clutching a book before rolling his eyes as though her quiet composure offended him. His smirk widened with every glance, every judgment. The stage was his, and he played to the invisible audience that was forced to watch. Then, with deliberate carelessness, he stopped at a seat that was not his own. He glanced at the boarding pass tucked between his fingers, read the number, then stuffed it into his pocket without even looking again. The seat he had chosen was near the center of the cabin, spacious and perfectly angled toward the aisle. Without hesitation, he dropped into it, sprawling across the wide leather cushions as if he had claimed a throne. The jacket opened to reveal a crisp shirt and silk tie, his chest swelling with the satisfaction of the gesture. He tossed his expensive leather briefcase onto the neighboring seat, ignoring the startled glance of a man who had been preparing to take it. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he pushed the man's bag aside to the floor. "Find another," he said coolly, without even turning his head. The man blinked, his lips parted as if to protest, then pressed them shut and shuffled toward a flight attendant who could only bow her head and guide him elsewhere. The businessman's grin widened, his white teeth flashing in triumph. One move, and already the cabin was rearranged for his comfort. He snapped his fingers, and a flight attendant hurried to his side. "Champagne," he said, though the plane had not yet left the ground. "The good one, not the cheap stuff you pour when you think no one is looking, and bring it fast. I don't have time for incompetence." His voice was loud enough for at least 3 rows to hear, and he intended it so. It was important that people knew what he demanded, and more importantly, how quickly it was delivered. The attendant hesitated, then nodded and hurried away, her cheeks flushed with humiliation she could not afford to show. He leaned back, one arm draped lazily across the backrest, his legs spread wide as though even the generous space of the seat was not enough to contain him. He tilted his head back, surveying the cabin with the indulgent air of a man who believed the world existed to amuse him. Around him, passengers shrank into themselves. Some looked out the windows, though there was nothing to see but the tarmac. Others scrolled aimlessly through phones, their thumbs moving without thought. The tension spread like fog, thickening with every arrogant remark that fell from his lips. They had all seen men like this before, but rarely had they been trapped with one at 30,000 feet. A few rows back, a young couple whispered nervously to each other, their eyes darting toward him and then quickly away again. An older man in a neatly pressed suit pulled his newspaper higher, as though the print could shield him from notice. A mother tightened her hold on her young daughter, drawing her closer as if the very sight of the man could taint her innocence. But no one spoke. No one ever spoke. The champagne arrived quickly, the flute filled to the brim. He took it with a smirk and raised it slightly, not in gratitude but in mockery. "That's better," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "At least someone here understands service." He drained the glass in a single swallow, then thrust it back into the attendant's hands. Another. The glassy clink of crystal seemed to echo louder than it should have, a punctuation mark on his claim to the space. He was the center of gravity now, and everyone else revolved around him, whether they wished to or not. The hum of the engines continued, steady and uncaring, but within the cabin the balance had shifted. It belonged to him, or so he believed. As the plane taxied toward the runway, he reclined further, stretching as though settling into a long, victorious reign. His eyes drifted lazily over the passengers, daring any to meet his gaze. Most did not. Those who did quickly looked away, the fear of confrontation outweighing any flicker of indignation. He chuckled softly to himself, chewing the satisfaction like a sweet. In his mind he had already won the evening. The flight was his, the passengers his unwilling chorus, the crew his reluctant servants. The seat he had stolen was his throne, and no one would dare challenge him. Yet somewhere beyond the closed doors of the cabin, another passenger was making her way toward the gate. She walked with quiet steps and carried no sense of entitlement, yet her presence would soon transform the air more thoroughly than his arrogance ever could. The engines roared louder as the aircraft lifted from the ground, rising into the darkening sky. He raised his fresh glass of champagne once more, smiling to himself as the city lights shrank below. He believed the flight would pass in his control, in his dominance, in the echo of his own voice. What he did not know, what no one yet knew, was that the true test of strength had not even begun. The aircraft had settled into its climb, the rumble of the engines a constant background to the uneasy quiet of the cabin. The arrogant businessman had already established his dominance over the space, his voice too loud, his gestures too wide, his smirk too sharp. Passengers avoided his gaze, some sinking deeper into their seats, others feigning sleep, though their shoulders remained tense. The champagne flute on his tray was already half empty, and he swirled the remaining liquid with a self-satisfied rhythm, savoring the illusion that he controlled the room. Yet the silence he cultivated through intimidation was fragile, and it trembled with the weight of something unseen, something approaching. The doors at the front of the aircraft hissed open again, and another passenger stepped quietly into the cabin. She did not move like him. There was no flourish, no calculated performance, no demand for attention. She entered the aisle as if she were stepping into any ordinary space, her posture upright yet unforced, her steps measured and calm. She wore a plain sports jacket, a simple rucksack slung over one shoulder, her hair pulled neatly back in a bun. To the untrained eye, she was just another traveler, a woman returning from work or heading home after a long day. But to those who happened to glance her way, something subtle changed. There was a stillness about her, the kind that did not come from timidity, but from discipline. It was the quiet weight of someone who had lived inside pressure so intense that everyday tension could not touch her. She carried herself with an economy of movement that spoke of training so deeply ingrained it had become instinct. Her eyes, clear and steady, passed briefly over the rows of seats without lingering, but their calm sweep unsettled more than one passenger who found themselves instinctively pulling their arms closer, tucking their legs in, giving her space without knowing why. The flight attendants noticed too. Where the businessman had demanded their nervous service, this new passenger required nothing. Yet they straightened subtly as she passed, as though her composure shamed them for their forced subservience. They could not have named it, but there was an authority in her presence that had nothing to do with money or status. It was something deeper, older, forged in sweat and blood and discipline. She stopped halfway down the aisle, pausing at the row where the businessman had claimed his stolen throne. His broad shoulders sprawled arrogantly across the seat that was not his glass raised in a lazy toast to no one in particular. He was mid-sentence laughing at his own cruel remark directed toward a passenger 2 rows behind him when he noticed her standing there. Her gaze met the seat, then moved to him, calm and unwavering. She did not scowl, did not frown, did not even tilt her head in challenge. She simply stood, her posture steady, her presence quiet. But it was enough. The air shifted, the way it does before a storm, imperceptible yet undeniable. The businessman faltered for the briefest moment, his laugh catching in his throat before he forced it out louder, harsher, as though to cover the sudden crack in his performance. The passengers who had been watching with sidelong glances now found themselves holding their breath. They did not know the woman, did not know her history, her name, or what she carried within her. But they felt it. Something in their bones told them that the balance had changed, that the silent weight she brought with her was more powerful than the noise that had filled the cabin since takeoff. She lowered her rucksack gently to the floor, sliding it beneath the seat as though preparing for nothing more than an ordinary flight. Then she stood in the aisle, her eyes steady, her breathing calm. She did not rush, did not protest, did not demand her seat back. Instead, she let the silence linger, her very stillness a form of pressure that few could withstand. The businessman grinned wider, seizing the opportunity to reassert control. He leaned back further in the seat, spreading his legs wider, his arm draping lazily over the headrest. He raised his glass as though toasting her arrival. "Looks like someone's lost," his tone suggested, though the words themselves mattered less than the bravado with which he delivered them. A few passengers glanced nervously toward her, expecting a reaction, but none came. She did not move, did not blink, did not rise to the bait. Her silence was louder than his mockery, her composure sharper than his insult. It was the kind of silence that unsettled men who lived on noise, men who thrived on reactions, men who mistook arrogance for strength. He shifted slightly in his seat, a flicker of unease passing through his eyes before he smothered it with another smirk. In the back rows, whispers began. Teenagers raised their phones, pretending to scroll, but angling their cameras forward just in case. A mother pulled her child close and whispered, "Stay quiet," though her own eyes could not look away. An elderly man folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, adjusting his glasses to watch more clearly. Something was building, and they all knew it. The woman Ronda Rousey, though only a few recognized her yet, folded her hands loosely in her lap as she lowered herself into a seat 1 row behind. Her posture remained straight, her breathing even, her eyes still fixed calmly on the man who sprawled in her rightful place. She had no need to announce herself. Her silence, her composure, her very existence was already enough to unbalance him. The businessman's grin twitched at the edges. He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, staring directly at her. His voice rose, booming across the cabin, desperate to reclaim the stage. "What's the matter? You got something to say?" His words were sharp, pointed, a blade thrown into the silence. The 3 passengers seated across the aisle giggled nervously, their laughter brittle, Forced, not the carefree giggles they had given him before. They too sensed that the performance was slipping out of his hands. But still she did not answer. Her gaze did not waver. Her stillness was its own reply, more devastating than any insult. The passengers began to feel the subtle duel taking shape. They could not articulate it, but they saw it. His flailing need to dominate, her unshakable calm that refused to bend. It was not yet a confrontation, not yet a fight, but it was something deeper. The clash of noise against silence, arrogance against control, false power against real strength. And though no blow had been exchanged, many felt they already knew how it would end. The engines droned on, the plane cutting steadily through the sky, but inside the cabin the hum of tension had grown louder than the roar of the turbines. People sat straighter, their eyes darting between the businessman and the quiet woman. Their phones hovered higher, cameras ready to capture whatever might follow. They did not know her name, not yet, but they felt the truth pressing against them. The balance of power in the cabin was shifting, and the man who thought himself untouchable was about to learn just how fragile arrogance could be. And Ronda Rousey, calm as stone in a storm, waited. She did not seek the fight. She never had, but she knew what was coming, and she was ready. The engines hummed with their steady rhythm as the aircraft leveled out, cruising through the night sky. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly, casting the business class in a softened glow that might have been comforting if not for the tension that now clung to every row. Passengers shifted restlessly in their seats, some still pretending to read or work on their devices, though their eyes flicked constantly toward the same point of focus. The balance of the flight had tilted since the quiet arrival of the woman who had taken a seat behind the businessman, and though not everyone could define what they felt, the atmosphere carried an electric weight. Silence had become louder than words, and every breath seemed to anticipate the inevitable crack that would follow. The businessman, drunk on his own sense of control and unwilling to accept the shifting tides, leaned forward in his seat. He had expected deference. He had expected avoidance. He had expected the same submissive silence that had always followed him. Yet now there was a different silence, one that did not bend to him but resisted. It unnerved him in ways he could not articulate, so he did what men like him always did. He made himself louder. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice carrying over the cabin, sharp and theatrical. He gestured broadly toward the calm woman behind him, as though he were presenting her to the rest of the passengers. "Sitting there like she belongs here. Did nobody tell you these seats aren't for the help?" His laugh followed immediately, loud and braying, bouncing off the leather headrests and the polished panels of the overhead bins. A few passengers cringed visibly, others lowered their eyes, but everyone heard. The woman did not answer. She remained still, her hands folded loosely, her gaze steady. Her composure seemed to mock him more deeply than words could have. He smirked, feeling the sting of her silence and determined to break it, to prove that his voice was the only one that mattered. He leaned back again, draping himself across the seat as though he were a king on his throne, and raised his voice louder still. "You think you can just walk in here, take up space, and no one will notice? Let me educate you. This is business class. People like me sit here. People like you, well..." He trailed off deliberately, letting the implication linger like a foul stench. Somewhere in the middle rows, a phone was raised just a little higher, its lens catching the glow of the cabin lights. The soft red dot of recording pulsed like a silent witness. Others followed suit, cautious at first, then bolder as the tension grew. They knew something was happening, something worth remembering, something worth sharing. The businessman noticed too, and it only fueled him further. He lived for the audience, thrived on their unwilling attention, and if cameras were rolling, then he would give them a show. He shifted in his seat, turned more fully toward the aisle, and with a cruel grin, lifted his polished shoe onto the edge of the woman's armrest. The leather sole, caked faintly with city dust from the streets he had strutted across earlier, hovered deliberately close. "Go on," he sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "Make yourself useful. These shoes don't clean themselves." His laugh tore through the cabin again, jagged and mean, and though a few nervous giggles rose from passengers who didn't know how else to respond, the sound was hollow. The cruel performance was cracking, the discomfort in the air too heavy to ignore. And then, with the exaggerated confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, he lashed out. His foot shot forward, connecting sharply with her chest. Gasps erupted from every corner of the cabin. The sound of impact was a blunt thud that seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the confined space. A woman at the far end of the row cried out. A man instinctively half rose from his seat before sinking back down, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. The businessman leaned back with a triumphant grin, lifting his arms slightly as though expecting applause. But there was no applause. There was only silence, thick, horrified, unrelenting silence. Passengers stared in disbelief, their eyes wide, their breaths caught in their throats. The cameras caught everything, the arrogant smirk, the violent kick, the stillness that followed. Even the flight attendants froze, hands hovering uselessly at their sides, their training torn between maintaining calm and the fear of intervening against a man of wealth and influence. The woman rocked slightly under the force, her shoulders shifting back, but she did not fall. She did not gasp. She did not even raise a hand to steady herself. Instead, she drew in a single, slow breath, her spine remaining straight, her eyes locking once again on the man before her. There was no anger in her gaze, no panic, no fear. There was only calm, unyielding, and absolute. The businessman faltered, just for a moment. He had expected her to stumble, to cry out, to shrink under the weight of the blow. He had expected her to collapse into the role of victim, the role he had written for her in his performance. Instead, she sat unbroken, unmoved, her calmness sharper than any strike. His grin wavered, then reformed, though thinner now, stretched tight over the sudden tremor in his pride. He let out a laugh, but it came too loud, too forced, cracking at the edges like glass under pressure. "What's the matter, Reed?" he barked, his voice wobbling despite his effort to steady it. "Cat got your tongue?" He turned his head toward the rows behind him, searching for validation, for laughter, for the chorus that had always answered his cruelty. But there was none. The passengers were silent, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the woman who had just absorbed his violence without flinching. Phones were raised higher now, every angle capturing his arrogance, his cruelty, his unraveling. For the first time, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Doubt. It burned hotter than humiliation, sharper than shame. He tried to drown it with noise, raising his voice louder, his words stumbling over each other in desperation. "You think you're better than me? You think you can sit there and look at me like that?" His chest heaved, his hand gesturing wildly toward her, as though motion could fill the void that silence had carved into him. And then at last she spoke. Her voice was calm, low, steady, yet it cut through the cabin louder than his shouts. "That was your mistake." The words froze him in place. They froze the passengers too, their heads snapping up, their eyes widening, their bodies leaning forward involuntarily as though to catch every syllable. The businessman's smirk twitched, his breath caught, his chest tightened. For a heartbeat, the performance faltered completely, and everyone saw it. Passengers began to whisper, soft ripples of awe and disbelief spreading from row to row. A young boy whispered to his mother, "Who is she?" A man muttered under his breath, "She didn't even move." The cameras captured every angle, their red dots glowing like tiny fires in the darkened cabin. The businessman laughed again, louder, harsher, the sound brittle with panic. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he demanded, his voice rising toward a shout. He gestured at the passengers around him, flinging his arm wide as though to remind them of their silence. "Look around. Nobody's on your side. Nobody cares. They never do." He leaned forward, spitting his words with a desperate sneer. "This is my space. I sit where I want. I do what I want." His foot pressed harder into the seat cushion, grinding dirt into the leather, as though to underline his control. But the spell had broken. His voice no longer commanded the cabin. His performance no longer inspired compliance. Every passenger knew it. They felt it in their bones, in the silence that pressed harder than his words, in the calm that radiated from the woman across the aisle. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved an inch. Yet the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The businessman saw it too, though he refused to admit it. His chest heaved with rage, his fists clenched, his smirk trembling as cracks spread across the mask of arrogance he had worn for so long. He had humiliated himself without realizing it, and the woman's silence had made it undeniable. The engines roared on outside, steady and indifferent, carrying the aircraft higher through the dark night sky. But inside, the air was heavy with inevitability. The passengers leaned closer, their hearts racing, their phones recording. They knew the moment was coming, the spark that would ignite the storm. The kick had not broken her, it had broken him. And though he could not yet see it, everyone else in the cabin knew the truth. The real fight had already begun. The cabin had grown so silent after her words that even the constant vibration of the engines seemed subdued, as if the plane itself were waiting for what came next. Passengers sat in rigid stillness, some with their hands gripping the armrests, others with phones held at discreet angles, recording every second of the strange and terrifying theater unfolding in the aisle. They had watched arrogance perform loudly for too long, and now they had seen it pierced by something far more unsettling than a shouted retort. Her voice, calm and deliberate, had broken his illusion more effectively than any insult, and yet she had not even raised it. She had merely spoken the truth with the kind of certainty that made his bluster seem paper-thin. The businessman's face burned red as he leaned closer across the aisle, his breath coming heavier, his eyes wide with the desperation of someone who felt his grip on the room slipping. He had always relied on noise to overwhelm, on status to silence, on money to protect him from consequence. But none of those things worked here. The silence was no longer passive. It was expectant, charged with energy, leaning in toward her instead of him. For the first time in years, he was no longer the center of gravity, and it terrified him. His laugh came loud and brittle, cracking like glass under pressure. He pointed a finger at her, his hand trembling despite his effort to make the gesture sharp. "You think you can sit there and tell me what to do? You don't know who I am. You don't know what I can do." His voice was booming, but the edges frayed, betraying the panic he fought to hide. He wanted to fill the cabin with his bravado, to bury her calm under layers of performance, but her stillness remained untouched. She sat with her shoulders square, her eyes unwavering, her body rooted like stone. Every time his words struck out, they dissolved against her composure. It was as though he were flinging fists into water, each one absorbed without resistance, leaving him more exhausted than before. The passengers could see it. They could feel the weight of the duel taking shape, not with fists yet, but with presence. He thrived on reactions, and she gave him none. He demanded submission, and she offered indifference. In that gap, his fury only grew. He slammed his hand against the armrest, the sharp crack jolting several passengers who gasped at the sudden violence. He rose halfway from his seat, his chest swelling as he leaned closer into the aisle. His eyes darted across the rows, searching for validation, but he found only averted gazes and cold stares. The people who had once laughed nervously at his cruel jokes now sat stiff and silent, unwilling to encourage him further. Even the three women who had giggled at his arrogance before stared at him with wide, uneasy eyes. Their laughter had dried into thin smiles that trembled with fear. He turned back to the woman, his voice dropping to a growl meant to intimidate. "You sit there like you're better than me, like you're above all of this. But you're not. You're nothing without people like me letting you breathe." He leaned in closer, so close now that his words reached her face like a spray of venom. The veins in his neck bulged, his jaw tightened, his smirk stretched painfully thin. He believed he could force her to flinch, to break, to yield even a flicker of fear. She did not move. She did not blink. Her eyes, calm and steady, met his with the same unflinching certainty they always had. There was no fire in them, no overt challenge, no fury. Only the cool, controlled patience of someone who had stood in cages before thousands, who had endured blows far greater than a man's shouting, who had been trained to breathe evenly under the crushing pressure of real combat. Her silence was not weakness. It was mastery. It was the embodiment of discipline honed over years, the quiet strength that only those who had suffered and endured could wield. That silence spread through the cabin like a contagion. Passengers who moments ago had been trembling began to feel the faintest thread of reassurance in her composure. They recognized, even if they did not yet know her name, that she was not afraid. And if she was not afraid, then perhaps they did not have to be either. Their eyes rose, their phones tilted higher, their breathing steadied. The current of power that had once belonged to him was draining away, drawn irresistibly toward her. The businessman sensed it too, and it drove him into a frenzy. His pride, his identity, his entire sense of self had been built on the ability to dominate spaces, to bend them to his will with noise and arrogance. Now confronted with a woman who would not yield, he found himself unraveling. He grabbed at the armrest of her seat, his fingers curling tightly as though he could physically dislodge her with brute force. The passengers gasped again, a collective intake of breath, and several phones caught the moment in trembling frames. The woman's posture did not break. She allowed his hand to press against the armrest, allowed him to lean into her space, and then slowly, deliberately, she raised her eyes to his with that same calm steadiness. "Move your hand," she said softly. Her voice was quieter than his roar, but it cut sharper than any scream. It carried the kind of authority that required no volume, no force, no performance. It was not a plea. It was not even a threat. It was a command, rooted in the certainty of someone who knew she could enforce it if necessary. The businessman recoiled slightly, his grin faltering. He tried to cover it with another loud laugh, throwing his head back, showing his teeth to the cabin as though inviting them to join in. But no one laughed, not one person. The silence had grown too heavy, too aligned with her. His performance rang hollow, and he could feel it. He turned back sharply, desperation twisting his features. "You think you can tell me what to do?" His voice rose again, almost cracking with strain. "You think anyone here cares what you say? Look around. They're scared. They'll never back you up." He gestured wildly, his arms sweeping over the rows of passengers. But instead of the agreement he sought, he found only silence, judgment, and the cold stare of dozens of cameras capturing every second of his unraveling. The woman breathed steadily, her gaze never leaving his. Her stillness had become unbearable, her calm the mirror in which his chaos was exposed for all to see. For the first time, the passengers began to realize the truth. The man's loudness was not strength but desperation, not dominance but insecurity dressed in noise. And her silence, her composure, was far more commanding than any display of arrogance. The duel had crossed a line now. It was no longer words, no longer performance. The tension had sharpened into inevitability, pressing down on every soul in the cabin. The passengers could feel it, their hearts pounding, their breaths shallow. They knew the storm was coming, that the noise would lash out at the ice, that fire would strike against stone. And though they did not yet know how, they could sense what the outcome would be. The businessman clenched his fists, his chest heaving as he tried to summon the courage to strike again, to reclaim the space that had slipped from his control. But the truth was already written in the air around them. His arrogance had ignited the fire, but her silence had frozen it in place. The next move would not be his victory. It would be his undoing. And as the engines roared on, indifferent to the human storm inside the cabin, the passengers sat suspended in that heavy silence, their eyes wide, their phones raised, their hearts caught in their throats. They knew as surely as she did that the reckoning was only moments away. The moment teetered on the edge of collapse, the kind of fragile stillness that trembled with the weight of inevitability. The businessman's face was twisted in a mask of fury, his fists clenched, his chest heaving as he leaned into the aisle, looming over the woman who had not flinched once. His laughter had already cracked, his words had already frayed, and the silence of the cabin pressed against him like an invisible wall. Dozens of eyes watched, dozens of cameras recorded, every lens capturing his unraveling. And yet his pride, swollen and desperate, refused to retreat. Pride would not let him stop. Pride demanded another act. With a guttural shout, he lunged forward, swinging his arm clumsily toward her shoulder as though to shove her out of the seat, to reclaim his dominance with raw force. It was not the strike of a trained fighter, but the flailing blow of a man who had never been resisted. The passengers gasped as one, the collective sound of fear surging through the rows. The moment stretched into eternity, every breath suspended as the arc of his arm cut through the dim light of the cabin. But before it could land, her body moved with the fluid precision of instinct. She rose from her seat in one seamless motion, her hand snapping upward to intercept his wrist with a crack of flesh on flesh that echoed louder than his shout. His eyes widened in shock, his momentum halted in midair. For the first time, he felt his strength dissolve under the grip of someone who understood leverage, who had spent a lifetime dismantling opponents larger, stronger, louder than him. She twisted his arm with smooth precision, not hurried, not frantic, but deliberate, folding his strength back upon itself until pain lit across his features and a grunt broke from his throat. Gasps filled the cabin, the passengers leaning forward as though pulled by invisible strings. Some clutched their mouths, others their armrests on them, their eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of a man who had loomed so arrogantly now, bent under the controlled grip of the quiet woman. The phones caught everything, the angle of his contorted arm, the stunned disbelief in his face, the calm control in hers. She did not stop at the twist. With a sharp pivot of her hips, she redirected his weight, his own aggression becoming his downfall. In the blink of an eye, he was lifted off balance and hurled downward in a throw, so clean it looked effortless, as though she were sweeping dust from a table. His body slammed against the carpeted aisle with a hollow thud, the sound reverberating through the cabin, rattling the seats, stealing the breath from every witness. The businessman's cry of pain was swallowed by the collective gasp of the crowd. For a heartbeat, there was silence, stunned and absolute. Then came the murmurs, whispers racing down the rows, disbelief turning into awe. Someone muttered, "She threw him like he was nothing." Another voice whispered, "That's Ronda Rousey." The name rippled through the cabin like fire catching dry grass, passing from seat to seat until nearly every passenger understood who she was, why she had been so unshakable, why her silence had been more terrifying than his roar. On the floor, the businessman groaned, scrambling to rise. His pride screamed louder than the pain in his arm, dragging his body upward with trembling limbs. His face was red with fury and humiliation, beads of sweat streaking across his forehead. He staggered to his feet, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes burning with a rage that could not mask his fear. He lunged again, his fists swinging wildly, fueled not by skill but by desperation. She sidestepped with the grace of water flowing around stone, her body turning just enough to let his strike cut through empty air. In the same motion, she caught his wrist once more, locked it tightly against her chest, and twisted until his knees buckled. His scream pierced the cabin, a high, strangled sound that revealed the truth of his weakness. She released him before the joint gave way, letting him stumble backward, clutching his arm as if it might fall from his shoulder. The passengers gasped again, but this time their fear was laced with something else: exhilaration. They had seen the balance change, had witnessed arrogance crumble before discipline, and their silence was no longer born of dread, but of awe. Some began to applaud softly, hesitantly, their hands meeting in cautious rhythm as though afraid to shatter the moment. Others whispered furiously, their words sharp with amazement, their eyes fixed on the woman who stood steady, her breathing calm, her gaze unwavering. The businessman, humiliated and broken, but still chained to his pride, staggered upright once more. His face twisted, spittle flying from his lips as he shouted curses, his voice cracking, betraying the weakness beneath the noise. He charged again, slower now, his movements sluggish, his fists trembling. It was a pitiful spectacle, a man stripped of his illusions, flailing in front of the very people he had sought to impress. She caught him easily, her hands guiding his chaos aside, her movements fluid and measured, as though she were correcting the sloppy attempt of a student in a gym. A sharp palm strike to his chest stole his breath, sent him stumbling backward into a seat. He coughed and wheezed, clutching at his ribs, but his pride forced him up again, his body trembling with exhaustion. He swung wildly once more, and again she deflected, hooking his leg with hers in a seamless motion that sent him sprawling hard onto the floor. This time, he stayed down longer. The thud of his body against the carpet was followed by a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls of the cabin. He groaned, his chest heaving, his lips split and bleeding, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. He tried to rise again, his arms trembling, his body bent, but every movement betrayed his weakness. His bravado was gone, shredded by her precision, his pride collapsing under the weight of her control. The passengers erupted, their applause louder now, freer, no longer tinged with fear. Some cheered openly, others laughed in disbelief, their voices overlapping in a wave of sound that filled the cabin. The chant began hesitantly, then grew bolder. Her name whispered, then spoken, then shouted, "Rousey! Rousey! Rousey!" The rhythm rolled through the rows, echoing against the walls, drowning out his wheezing protests. The three women who had once giggled at his arrogance now sat frozen, their faces pale with shame. They looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the passengers who had witnessed their complicity. The man they had encouraged had become a spectacle of humiliation, and the woman they had ignored had become the center of the cabin's respect. Still, the businessman tried to rise again, clutching at his seat, his eyes wild, his words jumbled. "You don't scare me," he spat, though his voice was broken, his chest heaving. He reached for anything, desperate to salvage even a shred of dignity. His hand closed around the umbrella protruding from a nearby passenger's bag, and with a roar, he brandished it like a weapon. Screams erupted, passengers ducked, flight attendants backed away. The cabin flared with panic, but she remained calm, her eyes locked on him, her body steady. As he swung the umbrella in a wild arc, she stepped forward with perfect timing. Her hand struck sharply against his wrist, sending the makeshift weapon clattering to the floor. In the same motion, her fist snapped upward, connecting with his jaw, his head jerking back with the impact. Before he could collapse, her knee drove into his stomach, folding him in half, his breath ripped from his lungs in a strangled gasp. He crumpled against the seats, wheezing, his body sagging under the weight of pain and defeat. The cabin erupted again, applause crashing like thunder, voices rising in unison. Her presence towered above him, not through fury or cruelty, but through the undeniable authority of discipline and control. She did not gloat, did not raise her arms in triumph. She simply stood steady, her breathing calm, her silence more devastating than any insult. The businessman, broken and humiliated, lay on the floor of the aisle, his pride shattered beyond repair. His arrogance, once loud and suffocating, was nothing now but a pathetic whisper drowned beneath the roar of admiration for the woman who had silenced him. And as the plane continued its steady path through the night sky, every passenger knew they had witnessed more than a confrontation. They had seen arrogance dismantled by calm, fire extinguished by ice, pride broken by strength that did not need to shout. The aisle of the aircraft remained heavy with the echoes of what had just transpired. The businessman lay crumpled near the seats, his expensive suit twisted, his body trembling from exhaustion, his face streaked with sweat and humiliation. The chant that had risen moments before, her name spoken in awe by strangers who only now realized who she was, still lingered faintly in the cabin air, like an aftershock of a storm that had already passed. Passengers sat upright, their eyes wide and shining, their phones held steady in trembling hands as if afraid that lowering them might break the fragile reality of what they had witnessed. The engines hummed their steady rhythm, indifferent to the chaos that had filled the business-class cabin, carrying the plane through the night sky toward its destination. Outside, the world was darkness, broken only by pinpricks of starlight. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Where tension and fear had once strangled every breath, there was now relief, admiration, and the electric charge of having witnessed something extraordinary. People whispered to one another, their voices hushed but urgent, like conspirators retelling a legend even before it had ended. The businessman groaned, pushing himself up on trembling arms, his face twisted with disbelief. Every attempt to rise was slower than the last, his body broken by his own rage, his pride shattered by her calm. He looked around the cabin for allies, for even a single nod of sympathy, but met only judgment, contempt, and worse still, amusement. A voice from somewhere near the front muttered, "Pathetic," sharp and cold. Another added louder, "Next time, keep your hands and feet to yourself." Laughter rippled down the rows, cutting into him deeper than any strike could. His cheeks burned crimson, his jaw clenched tight, but he had no strength left to respond. He was no longer a figure of power, but a spectacle of humiliation. Clutching at the seat backs for support, he staggered toward the exit of the cabin, his once proud stride reduced to a limp. When the plane leveled after a patch of turbulence and the seatbelt light flickered on, he ignored it, too desperate to escape the stares, the cameras, the humiliation that pressed against him from every side. At the curtain dividing business class from economy, he turned once, his eyes filled not with dominance, but with the desperation of a man stripped of his illusions. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. He turned again and stumbled through the curtain, vanishing into the shadows of the rows beyond. A collective exhale passed through the passengers. It was as though the entire cabin had been holding its breath for hours and only now dared to release it. Applause broke out, not hesitant this time, but loud, rolling, free. Hands clapped, voices cheered, and for the first time since the plane had taken off, laughter rang genuine, warm, and relieved. People looked at her, some with awe, some with gratitude, some still shaking their heads as if trying to comprehend what they had seen. She did not raise her hands, did not acknowledge the applause, did not bask in the glow of admiration. She simply sat back down in her seat, her breathing even, her face calm, her gaze directed forward as though nothing extraordinary had taken place. For her, it had not. It had been another fool corrected, another arrogance broken, another reminder that strength without discipline collapses under its own weight. She reached down to adjust her backpack near her feet, her movements precise, deliberate, ordinary. Yet her silence spoke louder than the chants, louder than the applause. It was a silence that carried weight, that lingered in the thoughts of everyone around her. The passengers, one by one, quieted their cheers, settling back into their seats. But they could not stop glancing at her, could not stop whispering to each other about who she was, what they had just witnessed, what lesson had been carved into the night. A woman seated across the aisle leaned closer, her voice soft but trembling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He was terrifying. You stopped him." The woman nodded slightly, her expression calm, her reply simple. "Silence doesn't stop arrogance. It only feeds it. Sometimes you have to stand." The passenger sat back, her eyes wet with relief, holding her young daughter closer, the words embedding themselves deeper than any speech could. Another man further back spoke with the nervous awe of someone who had just brushed against legend. "How did you stay so calm?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Anyone else would have lost it." She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, her voice steady and low. "Anger is easy," she said. "Arrogance is easier. But control, that is strength. Anyone can fight. Not everyone can end a fight before it begins." Assam. The cabin grew quiet at her words, the truth of them sinking in. Heads nodded slowly. The lesson had been spoken, and it would be carried long after the flight was over. Outside, the sky stretched on endlessly, stars glinting against the vast dark. Inside, passengers exchanged glances, whispered their disbelief, some already replaying the footage on their phones, watching the throws and strikes frame by frame. The videos would spread before the plane even landed, racing across social media faster than the aircraft's wings could carry them. Titles would appear before dawn. Millionaire businessman humiliated by Ronda Rousey at 30,000 feet. Champion teaches arrogant bully a lesson mid-flight. Real strength isn't loud, it's calm. Some would dismiss it as another viral skirmish. Others would analyze it as a public lesson. But for those on the plane, the truth would live larger, etched into memory, unshakable. Hours later, when the plane touched down and passengers disembarked into the bustling terminal, their stories had already diverged into dozens of versions. Some embellished the details, some trimmed them, but at the heart of every telling was the same truth. Arrogance had been broken, and it had been broken by someone who had never needed to shout. For the businessman, The humiliation clung like a shadow. The footage followed him wherever he went. In boardrooms, whispers trailed him. On sidewalks, strangers smirked. His once carefully polished image was fractured, every mirror reflecting not just his face but the broken figure sprawled in the aisle of that plane. He had wanted the world to see him as powerful, untouchable. Instead, the world saw him humbled, dismantled, reduced to desperation by a woman whose calm revealed his weakness. No wealth could shield him from it. No connections could erase it. Pride had led him into the fire, and pride had been the first thing to burn. Meanwhile, she returned to her life with the same quiet she had carried onto the plane. She stepped off into the terminal with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her stride steady, her gaze forward. She did not linger to answer questions, did not seek attention. She moved through the crowd as though she were just another traveler returning home. But those who recognized her, those who had seen, those who had felt the weight of her composure, could not stop themselves from watching her pass with respect that words could not capture. That night, seated at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, her family around her, she mentioned nothing of what had happened until her mother's knowing eyes caught hers. "Rough flight?" her mother asked lightly. She shrugged, her voice as even as ever. "Just another man who thought arrogance made him strong." Her mother smiled faintly, nodding with understanding. "Did you teach him?" And the woman's eyes sharpened just slightly, her reply quiet but firm. "I always do." In the days that followed, the video spread across the world. Commentators argued over it on news programs. Social feeds exploded with praise. And millions replayed the moment where arrogance collided with discipline and broke apart. But those who had been there knew the truth best. It wasn't the throws or the strikes that had shattered him. It wasn't the physical power that left him broken. It was the silence, the calm, the composure that had dismantled him long before her hands ever touched him. And so the story of a single flight lived beyond the walls of the plane, carried in whispers, headlines, and retellings. But its heart was simple, a lesson as old as combat itself. Strength is not in the noise of arrogance, nor in the fury of pride. Real strength is calm. Real strength is control. Real strength never needs to announce itself. It simply waits. And when arrogance oversteps, it ends the fight before it even begins. The flight had ended. The night had passed, but the lesson lingered, written into the silence she left behind. Don't let this be the last story you see tonight. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss what happens next, and make sure to check out our other shocking stories waiting for you. And if this one hooked you, share it with your friends. Let them feel the adrenaline too.